You're listening to the PR Wind Down Podcast, the show for public relations professionals who are ready to see real change in the PR industry. We are your hosts, April Margulies and Laura Schooler. Let's get ready to wind down.
All right, so should we kick things off today with the... We're going to kick things off today with Laura's siren. Now we're kicking it off with Laura's honking horn. All right.
It's crazy out there today.
Is there something happening?
Yeah, it's called New York City.
Okay. So let's kick it off with questions clients always ask.
Interesting because it's kind of a pre-client question. When you're pitching new business to a potential client and you really do not have the exact direct experience in their industry, they often ask, what experience do you have in my specific industry? What do you say to them? I mean, think about it. This is when you're trying to win business from them. And you know in your heart of hearts that you don't have that specific industry experience within your own agency, yourself, people there. So let's say, it's a banking client and you don't have somebody who's worked for a bank, or, you've never had a banking client before. Or, let's say it's AI client and you've had like virtual reality type clients, but not, artificial intelligence, because everybody has something that's peripheral. But a lot of times clients want you to have the exact specific experience. And what do you do in that case?
The best thing you can do is get as close as possible. So if you've got a client that needs to reach similar outlets, so at least you could say, we've pitched all the media outlets or half of them that are relevant to you because of this client. We had a client that had an AI component and it was this. And so we think we're well positioned for it. So I think it's just a matter of showing them that A, you understand enough about the space that you're going to be able to jump in and do it no problem. And B, that you know the outlets already that you'd be pitching on their behalf. Or you can say, we pitched all these trade outlets for this other client that are very niche. We would do the same for you. The other thing you could do is show up for that new business pitch, having done a bananas amount of research about the industry, their competitors, which publications you'd pitch, and then just show up, swinging for the fences. And, that requires a certain amount of new business budget or time. But if you've got it and you want to spend it because you think it's worth it, because they have a big budget, or it's a client you're really dying to have, or an industry you're really dying to break into, then, it might be worth it to go and do almost your own SWOT analysis, basically, right?
Yeah, do some like really in-depth
research
that they might not have done themselves, that they might even be able to use. To add on to that, I
wouldn't give it to them, but I would speak to it, right? I wouldn't give it to them for free.
I wasn't intending on going down that road, but to build on to what you just said, and then I have something else to add to it.
Cool.
Is if you come in some really great, creative, different ideas that illustrate your understanding of PR, of their industry, and give them an idea or two that they may probably have never thought of before, I think that wows people. And sort of tacking onto that, you need to bring your best, smartest personality to the meeting so that they're really buying into you as much, if not more, than the specific industry. So if you can sell them through your charm and personality and, smarts and all that, and then also bring really interesting creative ideas to the table, they may be so taken with you that they are less stuck on the idea that you're not a member of the club.
So to your point, Laura, the other thing, which kind of goes without saying, but I should say it anyway, is that if you've got somebody in your team that has that experience that you can bring and say, so-and-so has AI experience or whatever it is, that's definitely important. And another kind of sneaky way to do it is to go find somebody that you recruit that would be on that account team, but isn't yet part of your agency that you bring into the pitch meeting. And you say, we haven't done it under this umbrella of this agency, but this person has great experience. They've worked for blank, 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 blank. And you list off their incredible credentials. And then that inspires a lot of confidence too.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Tell them that you'll hire somebody, or you have hired somebody, or you are hiring somebody who has direct experience.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if you can get by with it looking like they're already hired, all the better.
Yep. I've seen it happen, and I've seen it work. I think that's a very useful discussion.
I hope so. Okay, good. Hey, I think I hear our guests joining.
Oh, great. Let's let them in. Oh, they're both in the same room. Hello, everybody. We've got two guests joining us today, Diana Neille and Richard Poplak. Diana and Richard are the directors behind the industry-exposé documentary Influence, the rise and fall of the world's most dangerous public relations company, which premiered at Sundance last year. Diana is an award-winning journalist and filmmaker from Johannesburg, South Africa, and has founded two media startups with an emphasis on investigative journalism. And Richard is an award-winning author, journalist, and filmmaker, and has reported from over 30 developing countries for news outlets across the world, also with an emphasis on investigative journalism. All right. April and I have both had a chance to watch your amazing film, and we have some questions for you. So anyway, just let's kick it off.
Right.
How did you first hear about Bell Pottinger and its activities?
Well, I mean, Bell Pottinger sort of notorious, or were notorious prior to their fall within, I would say, if you're working the corruption beat on the African continent, you were likely to have come across their name, mostly because they worked a lot in the extractive sector and mining. But there were always sort of persistent rumors about the fact that these guys were the bad guys of public relations. The public relations industry that does the hardcore work does not come out of the United States. It comes out of the United Kingdom. It comes out of London. That's where the whitewashing industry originated, and that really is its home. Mm-hmm. And Bell Pottinger were kind of one of the famous guys. But there was so little really understood about them, even though some really, really good work had been done up until around 2016, when stories really started to break about this company and some of the work that they'd done. And there was effectively kind of like a leaked document that suggested they'd been doing a lot of work around the African continent. We'd got a hold of that leaked document. It suggested that they were doing some really, really bad stuff for our president at the time, Jacob Zuma, who was manifestly one of the most corrupt leaders in charge of a country at the time. And so the story sort of built on from there. And I'd actually had an encounter with one of their partners. I think that was in February 2017.
That Jonathan Neille?
No, that was Philip Peck, who sent me a cease and desist because I made the assertion that they were essentially writing messaging for the president. They sent me a cease and desist. A whole bunch of nonsense started, which brings us, I guess, to the Gupta leaks.
Yeah, so in about May 2017, our editors at Daily Maverick, which is a pretty prominent news publication here in South Africa, approached us and said that, something really big transpired, that they had received this leaked tranche of emails, kind of like the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers that your, American audiences would be familiar with, that kind of detail the extent of the state capture project, as we call it here, which essentially means this corrupt faction within the governing party, the African National Congress, that was hollowing out our kind of governing bodies for corrupt means. And the president at the time had this family who were kind of financially backing him, called the Guptas. And it was their emails that had leaked and had come into the possession of our team. And, kind of very prominent within those emails was Bell Pottinger, because they had been essentially being contracted, won the contract to work for Bell Pottinger for a pretty significant sum, had started, and I think it was towards the end of 2015, and had produced at that stage a year and a half's worth of really, really divisive content that was essentially, the plan was to distract from the corrupt activities of this little cabal within the government and kind of place the focus on troubling or problematic race relations in South Africa and pushing those divisions pretty aggressively in a way that we were really starting to feel by that point in 2017. That was kind of when, at least when I became familiar with the name and the extent to which they were involved in our politics. And I said to Richard, look, they're doing this here, they're doing it somewhere else as well. And of course, that was brought to bear in a pretty big way.
So how did you guys get Lord Tim Bell to agree to participate? And did you have to wait until he passed away a couple of years ago to release this?
The answer to those questions is I don't know and no. The genesis for the idea for the film came from Diana. She felt like there was a documentary in trying to explicate the activities of this company. So herself and our producers dispatched me to London to go track down Lord Tim Bell. And I sort of chased up with his contacts, eventually got a number through somebody that...
You had a couple of expensive drinks and a couple of
yeah,
expensive
a couple of expensive
bars
drinks.
as well.
I certainly did that.
Yeah.
I may have had some fun. But eventually I rang him up and he said, well, come on over. So the following morning, I went over to his house. I said, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to make this movie regardless of your involvement. That said, should you become involved, at the very least, you have a chance to tell your story, and we will give you absolutely all the time you need. All I request is a minimum of 3 days. And he ended up giving us 5. It's the question about this project that Diana and I ask each other most. Why? Why did he agree?
Yeah, but to me, it's central to his character, which is that he was an epically confident man who was very proud of what he had done with his life. And in many respects, deservedly so. It's just that the nature of the work that he did was bombastic and egregiously unethical and terrible. But he didn't see it that way. He saw himself as having a role to play in the lives of powerful people and, you know, helping people with problems, as he put it. And I'm sure it's a line that one hears in the kind of crisis communications or crisis management sector and the PR sector a lot, that, you know, your clients are people who have issues that need to be solved. Unfortunately, the issue that a lot of his clients needed to be solved was which town should we bomb today? And, you know, how many people's names do we need to cross off this list because they've disappeared? I think it was just natural to him that if you asked to speak to him and he respected you for whatever reason, or he felt that you were someone who was intelligent enough to ask him good questions, he would pretty much be game. I don't think that many people approached him because he seemed so unapproachable. He was a very, very powerful man.
Right.
So
it was a lot of guts.
You know what? In the film, he said something about how he always liked to be around celebrity or like, you know, famous people. And so I feel like a couple of things there. One is that finally he was getting to be the celebrity in this case, right? To be like the star of the film, et cetera, which he probably couldn't deny because of his, you know, ego, et cetera. And then also never to this level of, you know, like you said, genocide and, you know, the ruination of countries or whatever. But I have dealt with people who were questionable or divisive public figures, and the way that they see it, that they've hired you as the PR person as like their speechwriter, so to speak. Doesn't mean that you agree with them or that you're doing what they're doing. You're just writing their speeches for them.
Right.
And maybe that's the way he sort of like, I'm really good at public relations strategies and tactics, and that's what I do. What the content is not really my problem. I don't know if he saw it that way, but that's sort of how other people have.
There's a little bit of a quirk there because authoritarian right-wing figures, Tim greatly admired.
Yeah.
So while there was an element of impartial representation to a lot of the work that Bell Pottinger did, much of which was banal.
Yeah.
Much of which was simply putting out press releases for a small shoe company or a large mining company. You know, a lot of it was just the basics. But the prestige work was the geopolitical division, which was called Sans Frontières. And they did some really bad stuff for some really bad people who Tim deeply admired on account of their politics.
And valued those relationships and fostered them for a long time. I mean, one has to remember that he got his start in this industry and in many ways built the industry because he was Margaret Thatcher's unofficial advisor. And he didn't gun for that position. He wasn't even there when they won the account. You know, he was on some island somewhere, you know, doing the Playboy thing that he was so good at. Just a little story that I think is kind of illustrative. Apparently he would get his driver to drive him from the office to his favorite restaurant for lunch, even though it was literally a 200 meter, but 150 yards, so that he could pitch up for lunch with all the fancy people in his fancy car with his driver.
He could have walked there, but he wanted to roll up in the Rolls Royce or whatever.
Totally. In his Jaguar. Totally. So he wasn't even there when they won the account, but it became this unbelievably important relationship in his life and set him on this path of being at the left hand or the right hand or whatever you want to say of power around the world. And he loved that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is why some people get into politics or public relations, et cetera, to get that close to power when they know that, whatever, they're not a talented rock star. They're not a talented actor. They're not a talented politician, but they can do the behind the scenes stuff and get as close to being that as possible. And that's the way that they do it. Sounds like that might be his motivation.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting to note that I don't know how seriously he took a lot of it. If you look at some of the campaigns that they did, we had to cut this out of the final version of the film, but we had this quite a comprehensive section in the film for the initial Sundance version about Chile and the work that he did for Augusto Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, for his successor. And I mean, he literally thought the guy looked like Clint Eastwood. And so they built a whole campaign around that. And a lot of his work was fun and unserious and kind of, let's take the piss and see if anyone notices and if we can get away with this. Was also, I think, a big philosophy.
I mean, I don't know how much you guys are into American politics, et cetera. But when I was watching it, it really made me think how much of this stuff goes on in the United States behind Donald Trump, behind whomever.
Well, the answer to the question is lots. Image making, messaging, fake news, alternate realities, all of this stuff is the business of public relations at a geopolitical or a macro political level, which is the kind of work that Tim pioneered. And that is the key take home from his career, is that before Tim, you couldn't open a phone book and look for a political consultant of the top flight variety that Tim kind of invented. He pioneered that end of the business and he took it global, and that is the really important part of understanding his career, is that he understood that there was a relationship between advertising and politics, and he exploited that in a really, really effective way.
I think in the early days, before we had kind of completed our research and kind of gone to the depths of understanding his nature and the work that he'd done, the easy comparison was to Roger Stone. I mean, similar kind of, they're, these dandy men who like to flit about with powerful people. And, some similarities for sure, but I think Tim is a much more nuanced and more complex figure at the end of the day because of his history and because of the pivotal role that he's played in this whole industry. And Roger Stone just doesn't have that history behind him, but certainly that just unserious approach to really, really big geopolitical decision making and helping craft messaging for people who ultimately create a lot of chaos in the world. So yeah, I mean, that was something that we had considered early on.
So I was curious, based on what you were saying, if part of the inspiration for the film was to expose this weaponized communication that's been used against us in democratic societies.
The answer to your question is absolutely. What Tim's career demonstrated is that divisiveness works. As a political tool, getting people angry, getting people to hate, getting people inflamed is enormously effective as a political tool. That led on to a whole bunch of innovations down the line, which met digital revolution in a really, really important and transformative way. And so social media ended up being enormously transformative in how we communicate these political divisions and how we exploit these political divisions. And they ended up being very, very useful to men like Tim and his successors. So Tim was the ancestor, or one of the ancestors of all of the mess that we find ourselves in right now.
To your question, I mean, I think ultimately we wanted to make a film about the disinformation complex and how it originated and kind of give a sense of where it may be going, through the personal narrative of one man who happened to be very important in that space. But certainly that was, I think, what we hoped to talk about and hoped to really elicit discussion about was an age-old weapon, propaganda and the use of propaganda, but the way that it's been re-weaponized or newly weaponized using the internet and the tools that have become such a big part of our lives. You can't get into everything, but certainly those are the conversations that we hoped it would spawn going forward.
Right. And are you hopeful that in showing people how it works, that they'll be less susceptible to these influences?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We don't consider ourselves necessarily outcomes-based activist type filmmakers. We are, we're journalists, but I would like to think in my happy moments that, when you show people how the world works, when you expose them the underbelly, then we're a little better armed to deal with many of these kind of manipulative tools that exist to turn us into weapons that can be employed against each other.
Yeah, I also think what we discovered along the way for an PR audience or, an industry audience, we really did try to understand what is weaponized information. Nigel Oakes is a secretive figure. He was never spoken to the media before this film. Even in the film, it's kind of hard to make him out. He's an incredibly important man in the weaponized communication space. He pioneered so many of the uses of data way before anyone else was thinking about it. And he just kept a low profile. It was his colleagues at Cambridge Analytica who took the fall. And nobody could give us a straight answer. What do you do? Where do you start? What decisions do you make? Why do you make them? What is the outcome? What are the results? How can you measure the impact of these campaigns? And the answer is you can't. We always refer to it as a dirty bomb. It's like setting off a dirty bomb in a mall full of people. The result purely is chaos and misunderstanding and fear, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys think that this sort of weaponization is more of a tool of the, whatever you want to call, conservatives, right wing, etc., more than the left wing?
It was probably generated and pioneered by conservatives. But to say that the left doesn't use the same tools would be absurd.
Right.
That said, so much of the stuff has been hijacked for means that are not necessarily political in the conventional sense. In other words, there are obviously agents in our society here in South Africa, in your society in America, and elsewhere. Perhaps one of the most representative is Vladimir Putin, who understand chaos as opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Who understand the degradation of democratic norms and the degradation of democratic institutions as an opportunity to infiltrate spaces which they otherwise may not have been able to.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where these tools at their finest become very, very useful and very, very dangerous.
And is this motivation just pure ego power? I want to take over the world, or is there something else?
It's a great question. I do believe that someone like Vladimir Putin is a reactionary force. And that means that fundamentally they are agents of conservative power. Yeah.
And control.
And control.
Yeah.
So it does serve the reactionary agents far better than it does progressive agents.
Yeah.
That said, misinformation and the weaponizing of information on the left is still extant in many, many cases. But it's important to note that certainly in the UK context, certainly in the context of Lord Bell, much of this was generated by the conservatives and led to the formation of what I would call the neoliberal lexicon. In other words, the push right to which we have all been subject since the 1970s.
Yeah.
I mean, you might want to ask, is there a functional left in the United Kingdom anymore? The answer to that question is no.
No, it's been destroyed.
Which was decimated in the last election.
Right.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Same with like unions and such in the United States. So
Yeah.
Are you guys fans of the movie Wag the Dog?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Ages ago,
classic.
yeah,
That's a classic film. And
Right.
that is to an extent exactly what Tim did. That
Right.
said, unfortunately, the fictionalization of PR tends to be far more glib than the reality. This stuff tends to be sharper, funnier, and more entertaining than it is in real life.
Oh, documentary.
I was blown away how you drew such a direct line between big business and their interest in geopolitical results.
Absolutely.
And then basically funding whatever campaign they needed to based on where they had somebody in their pocket to get what they needed done for whatever business move they were going to make. I mean, that was to me incredible because it really shows that it's not so much about the politicians themselves as the forces behind
Sure.
those politicians who have the money and are pulling the strings, right? Everyone is sort of a puppet in between there.
Yeah, there's major forces going on behind the scenes. I think there's a really interesting example in the States that we've kind of discussed on and off through the last couple of years. What Richard hasn't mentioned, which is a point that he often makes, is that in this day and age of this huge partisanship that we all kind of deal with, Tim Bell played a pivotal role in helping conservative movements around the world shape their language and the language that they use to promote themselves and the language that they use to defend themselves. And that's key. He learned that at Margaret Thatcher's elbow, and the two of them together were this potent force. But, you know, that set the stage for a lot of the language that conservative movements use to this day, including in the United States. And I think a really interesting example to watch has been the Lincoln Project, which was essentially a group of kind of progressive conservatives going, you know what, this isn't going to work for us. Having seen how those communications tactics were working so very effectively for the conservative movement at that time and for Trump's campaign from 2016 and before that and onwards, flipped it on its head and started using those exact same tools against him in an increasingly effective way as the election drew closer. And I just think it's a really interesting example of understanding that the conservative movement has the language and is very effective at speaking in one voice about, the things that they care about. Whereas I feel like in many cases, the left is way softer, way less organized in that regard, way less willing to kind of weaponize their language, frankly, to their detriment.
One thing is important to know, and it goes back to April's question, which is about business and how business infiltrated and helped massage and at least pay for a lot of the messaging that was made at the time. And there's two things I'd like to say about this. The first is that the right is not a genuine coalition, right? With liberals and progressives, when you take the example of the Democratic Party, which is roughly the same kind of construction as the left here in South Africa or the UK, it's a genuine coalition of voices that has to be moderated to some degree to develop policy, and people have come to genuine consensus within what we'll talk about as the left. The right doesn't have to do that. That's what Tim understood the conservative movement to be, a business movement. That's what Thatcher understood the conservative movement to be, a business movement. In other words, there was a collusion between conservatives and business, a collusion that perhaps was manifestly corrupt, but certainly turned out to be corrupt. And that corruption and collusion defines how the right works today. And so much of the neoliberal messaging that we drink with mother's milk effectively defines how we speak about politics and define politics today.
I always say, you've got politics, you've got Republicans, you've got Democrats in the United States, but Wall Street really runs this country and maybe the world.
Right. And they're probably at the end of the day, to some of the points that we've made, they're party agnostic. It's just whoever they can get to, right? So if it's like
get the money, they don't care who gives it to them.
So speaking of power and control, I was curious to hear a little bit more, because you had mentioned in the film about how the Guptas were targeting journalists on Twitter and in general to quiet them when they were, raising issues that would expose them. So I'm curious to hear more about that, how it worked. And also, do you see that happening today with journalists elsewhere in the world?
What's so interesting about that? I feel like that stuff started happening, I want to say, a little earlier than it did in the States. Is that right? We started to feel this kind of undercurrent of something different to the norm. There's a lot of anger in this country, and rightfully so. It's a pretty messed up place. But this was different. There was something really malevolent going on, and there was just this unease, and it was seeping into the discourse. And really what it was, and it was so quick and simple, was that the Guptas were paying these guys to make fake accounts, which we now know it's kind of passé now, Twitter bots, and proliferating them online. The hilarious thing about it was that it was so unsophisticated at the time, and it was so early on in the development of weaponized social media. And they were using these, the usual kind of you get those spam emails from people in little companies in India. They were using people like that to run and manage these campaigns. So they were looking online at what they thought a typical South African name would be. And they were mixing up Afrikaans names with Xhosa names, or Zulu names with English names, names you would never in a million years hear here. For us, genuinely hilarious. And there were just hundreds of these things. And that was the kind of the birth of trolling in South Africa, targeting people who were known to be outspoken about certain things and seeding in this message of what's known here as white monopoly capital. So these kind of
racially charged,
very
slogans.
Triggering slogans that kind of harked back to apartheid. And a lot of those sayings were kind of dug up by Pottinger from activist campaigns back in the day. White monopoly capital, radical economic transformation.
Terms that would be meaningless to a North American audience and effectively are meaningless.
Yeah, they're just...
what does radical economic transformation mean?
But those have literally become the names of factions within politics now. It's become so entrenched. And these were names that were dug up by a PR company and used by bots to divide society. And it was so unbelievably successful. And I don't think any one of them ever thought about the ramifications long-term of these actions, but it's fundamentally embedded itself in our psychosocial politics in this country.
Right. So when you see movements sort of come to the forefront overnight, like Black Lives Matter or Antifa or something like that, do you automatically suspect or assume that they are the product of some sort of public relations campaign being done by a political force?
It's very difficult because of how divisive and how highly charged our politics are these days to mistake really solid organization and really long-term organization genuine social movements
Like Black Lives Matter.
for nonsense.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think people tend to miss is how old the movement is. It's over 9 years old, and how well organized it's been, how sustained. So organization is one of the cornerstones of progressive politics. Tim was concerned with the dissolution of genuine social organization. That will be in part his legacy. He was very, very good at doing that. So I think part of being a political journalist, which Diane and I most certainly are, is being able to discern between the bullshit of a PR campaign and a genuine social movement, which is rooted in grassroots organizing and on the ground coalition of forces, coalition building.
What are the signs that we're looking at something organic versus something orchestrated?
We work with some researchers here who are doing really, really incredible work at the Atlantic Council, and some local researchers who are really doing incredible work understanding, because in Africa, disinformation is a huge, huge problem right now. And to try to make sense of this, they categorize disinformation into 3 categories. So you've got your political disinformation, which is essentially paid for and perpetrated on behalf of political entities in order to help people and, get where they want to be. Then you have disinformation for profit, which is a little bit more kind of muddy, but makes sense as well. And then you have disinformation that's literally perpetrated by teenagers and crazy people who just find it fun and want to cause chaos for their own reasons. It's not commercial and it's not necessarily political. And to be able to kind of categorize those 3 helps to kind of get a sense of the scale of this thing and where these trends and this stuff is coming from. And obviously the political side of things is the most dangerous and the most well-funded, for very obvious reasons. But we have seen that so very strongly in the States over the last few years, and how incredibly powerful it has been in shaping your politics. I think January 6th is the perfect example of just how crazy this can get.
Right.
April, more specifically to answer your question about how you discern between the two, that actually takes time. It takes research into how movements are created and how organization happens. A genuine social movement can be enormously transformative, as BLM has been, but to a degree, a manufactured social movement can also be enormously dangerous. And that's the point.
I'm so curious, was it hard for you guys to get funding for this film, given how controversial it is in certain regards, right? In certain regards, it's not, but for big businesses and politicians, it certainly, pulls the curtain back a bit in a way that they might not appreciate. So I was curious, was that difficult for you?
It's a good question.
Yeah, it is. No, funding
actually.
This film wasn't particularly difficult. I think there was a lot of goodwill behind it, and there was a lot of real intention to kind of get the film made and to see it put out there. That said, there's been a lot of forces that have been against this film being seen. It is really challenging to the British political establishment. The Prime Minister of the UK right now, Boris Johnson, would probably consider Lord Tim Bell as a friend.
Well, he gave a statement at his funeral.
Yes, he eulogized him at Tim's funeral. So there's that there. There's also the fact that the British press is, I would argue, the worst in the Western democratic world. They're terrible. So they also have a vested interest in the story not necessarily being told.
And we're very against it from the start. We pitched this to certain organizations whose names I won't mention. Actually, screw it, the BBC. And they couldn't have been less discouraging if they had tried. And I mean,
and for obvious reasons.
The commissioning editor told us, frankly, as a reporter, she had worked with Tim and found him wonderful. And that was that. So, this is a film that we felt very strongly should be seen in the UK as the home of politicized disinformation and reputation management, and no one will broadcast it.
No one wants it to be seen. Yeah. So it was weirdly the inverse. I mean, obviously in the States it will be seen and hopefully consumed widely, but in the UK there does seem to be a reasonably coordinated effort to ensure that the film isn't widely distributed.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah.
That's so crazy. I'm also curious, just some of the nuts and bolts. Richard, it was you conducting most of the interviews. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Richard did most of the interviews.
Yeah, it was. He asked great questions. It seemed like,
did, right? Yeah.
He's
good.
I thought it was great. I'm also curious. It seemed like you must have had so much footage and so many interviews that you had to cut down into an hour and a half. Yeah. I'm curious, how many hours of footage do you have unedited?
Oh my gosh. Probably, I want to say around 35 hours of interviews alone. And then I guess another, more than that, right?
Probably about 40 hours of interviews, and then call it another God, I don't know. There was at least 100 hours.
And we approached probably 3 times the people that eventually appeared on camera. It was an immense effort, and the research that went into all of it, and the briefing documents, and we just did not want to take a risk that anyone could question the facts. And we really were very careful to make sure that our fact checking was beyond reproach. And that meant interviewing widely and leaving a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor, stuff that we would love to have used, but it's just very complex and full film with a lot of information. So it was tough. It was tough to make those decisions.
How long did it take you to do all of this from start to finish?
Surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, actually, it's not surprising at all. The fundraising process took the longest just because we were first-time feature filmmakers. We were kind of banking on our journalistic credentials. So, we were working with production companies, Storyscope and iSteel Film in Canada, who were kind of pushing that aspect of it. And we had to go with a kind of a mix of, very luckily, a mix of grant funding, some kind of Canadian tax rebate money, and then some equity investments as well. So it was a bit of a mix. But I think once we got that sorted out,
went relatively
quickly. We were shooting for, I want to say, a year, and then editing over the period of around June. So about 6 months of editing.
Wow, that's impressive.
We got into Sundance, that was the deadline, and we had to meet it, and that was,
So there were a lot of sleepless nights to finish that up. And did I read the credits? I was watching the credits and I thought, wait a second, Diana wrote the theme song, the heist theme song. Is that true?
Yeah, I did. I wrote it with some very good friends of mine. Thank you. Yeah, that was the fun, not depressing part of the process.
It's like, what can't she do? She can do it all.
Oh, that's fine. It was, I kind of forced it on Richard. I was like, I'm writing the theme song and I hope that's cool with you. And he was really supportive about it. So it was.
I think the song's great.
It's a great song. I mean, I sort of couldn't believe it once I saw the whole thing, and I thought, God, that's so impressive. And then wait a second, what?
It's kind, thanks.
So there was a quote in the film that said, "It's a new political landscape with no geographical borders." And I thought that was really interesting. I wondered if you wanted to comment on that comment that was made within the film, because that to me is really fascinating, right? Where you've got these multinational businesses that don't even care about individual countries. They're just going to affect whatever, the chessboard becomes the planet and then they do whatever they have to do on the planet to get what they want to do on the business side. That was interesting, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
So Richard's currently writing a book, which I'm helping with the research on for Penguin Random House about the gold mining industry. And it's kind of the perfect example of that. Barrick Gold Corporation is the number one gold mining company in the world. And they act as essentially a little proxy state. They buy up mines all around the world. They're not really privy, or they're not privy at all to the local legislation. They're not privy to any legislation from the country in which, they're registered, which is Canada. And they act with impunity as a result. So there's myriad human rights abuse complaints against them, and environmental complaints as well. And they just breeze through it because there's no jurisdiction and no one who can afford to take them on in a kind of effective legal manner. I suppose it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, the support for capitalism, or, rampant capitalism by certain political factions does allow these huge companies to take on the role of mini states in a way. And, they employ thousands and thousands of people around the world and affect many, many more through their actions. But it's very, very difficult to hold them to account. And they then have these incredibly powerful PR mechanisms to protect themselves and to spin a different story. So, I think that they've become these little states within states that are very, very difficult to get into line.
Fascinating. Well, that's exciting. Congrats on the book. I can't wait to read that.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. But I mean, of
course. Did I just woman-splain your book? I did. I woman-splained your book. It's a new era. It's fantastic.
Yay!
You did it all. No, you did a great job.
Let me explain your book for you.
Hell no. I got it. I'm just doing amazing work. So I guess I'm just proud of the work.
You're proud.
It's great.
Yeah.
He's shy,
And to Diana's point about these companies, they're deeply connected to ruling elites.
Absolutely.
It's really not magic. It's not secretive. Most of it's legal.
Yeah.
Most of it's out in the open.
I have a very important question before we
wrap. Okay, I'll let you ask the next one. Oh God, is it sports again?
It's not my fault. I didn't set it up.
Oh my God.
I am wondering, are you wearing a Los Angeles Dodgers hat?
I am. And the reason for that is we shot in Los Angeles last November. And of course, they won the World Series just shortly before. I have this weird fascination with baseball. We don't have much of an opportunity to watch it over here. Yeah. It feels like mildly more exciting cricket with better snacks. It was nice to catch up with American sports when I was in, because I actually love the NFL, believe it or not.
Really?
But we're a soccer and a rugby nation.
I don't know if it's known to Americans just how much of your culture surrounds everything the rest of the world does. Like we literally imbibe your culture, your sport, your politics.
Yeah, you guys do very good PR.
I think most Americans assume that everybody looks to us while we don't know anything about anybody else. That's pretty much the American way.
Well, that's the nice thing about being the most powerful one is you don't have to care about anybody.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're off on this other continent, whatever, who knows.
Awesome. Well, is there anything else that you guys wanted to touch on that we didn't ask about, or anything else you'd like to plug that you've got coming up next?
In the spirit of what we were talking about earlier, wanting to get the film out there, and we've actually managed to get some funding on our side here in South Africa to make the film available for free online to Africans and eventually in the United Kingdom. But it will also be quite a comprehensive website for people visiting from other places like the States, because it's been bought and licensed in the US. We obviously couldn't do it there. But, we wanted to build out something that was a bit more comprehensive as a resource about disinformation, using the film, I guess, as a jumping off point in the course of the conversations that we're having to be able to develop more resources about disinformation and how it works, who it affects, that kind of stuff. So, that's something that we're kind of really working on at the moment, is building out this website and making it something useful. So if your viewers or your listeners are keen, I guess around kind of the early June when it's up and running, go over to influence.film and just have a bit of a look.
Yeah, that's actually well noted. Yeah.
Yeah.
It should be an interesting experience.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you, guys.
Yay. No, it's really, really, really fun.
Cool. Thank you. It was so nice to meet you, ladies.
Thanks, guys. Stay safe.
Yeah.
Chat soon.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Take care.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye. Bye.
Let's hear the horror story, Laura. Give it to us.
I am opening the horror story, which neither of us have seen.
Amazing.
So this will be as shocking to us as it is to the audience. I was once on a client call where the client had to share his screen to show us a presentation of a product the company was about to introduce to the world. He had everything open on his screen in addition to the PowerPoint slideshow, which I didn't think about until he started getting a lot of messages popping up. They were very personal messages, I might add. The first one was a preview of a text message from a brunette girl who was sending an inappropriate photo of herself. Read, mostly naked photo. That said, you like it. Shortly thereafter, he received a Slack message from a different blonde girl who said, "Are you mad at me?" Just like that, not spelling out the R or the U, but using the shorthand letters R and U. He moved Slack off to the side of his screen, presumably onto his monitor, to respond to her. Another message popped up. "Oh, good, I'll call you in 3 minutes." He kept trying to present to us, but was clearly distracted and not talking in a linear or even mildly cohesive manner. The blonde girl called minutes later. He declined to answer. Again, a Slack preview popped up. "Are you mad at me?" With the same shorthand letters, R and U. By this time, I was trying to figure out who this woman was and found she was his employee.
Oh, God.
I was sucked into the drama like a TV show at this point and had no idea what he was saying or presenting. I was totally enthralled with the personal drama and watching his screen like an episode of Grey's Anatomy to see what would pop up next and how he would respond. I should also mention I was trying very hard not to laugh or even show on my face that I was paying attention to it at all, which became harder and harder as the drama unfolded. At the end of the video call, I had no idea what he had talked about, but I was so relieved that I was no longer on camera and could laugh my guts out. Here's a question for the hosts. If this happens to you on a client call, what do you do? Do you tell him we can see his screen? Do you pretend not to notice? Do you offer to reschedule since he seems busy? Do you just try to ignore the messages and focus on what he's trying to say, even if it's not cohesive given the drama afoot? And What do you do when the entire call went by without you knowing what the heck he even said? Oh my God, that's a good one.
I mean, that's outrageous. I think, I don't know what you do. I mean, I think you hope to God that you were recording the call through Fireflies or Zoom recording or something. You had some way to go back and listen to it so you could actually pay attention. I guess you could ask the client to send you the PowerPoint presentation or deck and hope that you could piece it together in retrospect. In terms of like what you say, I mean, I don't know if you can say anything unless you really know the client, but I wouldn't even say it on the call. If you have other people on there, you'd have to Slack them privately or text them, but assuming you have that relationship,
right?
That you could be like, hey, looks like you've got some issues happening with Blondie. Do you want to reschedule? Otherwise, I think you just have to put on your game face and pretend you're not seeing it and power through, don't you?
Well, I think that is what you would do if you got totally caught out like this person did. But now in retrospect, you know, armchair quarterbacking is never easy to do. But in retrospect, I mean, you should really say, hey, you have some other things going on that you need to attend to. We can reschedule this because I think it's very important for you and for us that we're able to focus on this and really get, you know, the full information that we need to do the initiative, the project, whatever. I mean, that's really what you should do, because for the sake of the account and the work that you're doing, I don't care that he's got, you know, 3 chicks slacking him or whatever. That's, you know, since you're not his employee, whatever. And you don't want your team, if you, like you said, have other people, you don't want them seeing this. I think you do have to shut it down no matter what your relationship is, but you just be all business about it. Like, irrelevant what the distraction is. It's a distraction, and any distraction is not effective when you're trying to get information from your client. I know it's a lot easier said than done.
Oh my God. Yeah, I think you're right.
Are you mad at, I mean, what was she, 12? I mean,
I know, right? So funny.
It's another issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you should do.
Okay.
What you're going to do, what's easy to do, probably not, but that's what you should do.
All right. I think that's fair. I think we can move on to the news of the day.
All right. So the news of the day is, I don't know if it's the most important thing or the least important thing. I'm torn. Why the New York Times is retiring the term op-ed. Now, what's funny about this is I always thought that op-ed meant opinion editorial, but apparently it means like opposite of editorial.
According to this, right?
Right, that the New York Times started this page in 1970. That it was supposed to be flying in the face of what the editorial board of the New York Times was saying, giving another point of view. I just thought it was any opinion about a topic, not something that the editors of the New York Times had delivered.
So what they were saying then is not that everything that's not opinion is editorial and everything else is opinion. They're saying we have the newspaper's opinion on something, and then we have the opposite opinion from outside the newspaper on the opinion piece.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, they are retiring the term op-ed.
And the reason is, which we didn't really explain for listeners who didn't read this opinion piece, which is an opinion piece in the New York Times. They say that they're doing it because in the older print newspaper design, that it was physically opposite to the editorial of the newspaper's opinion. And then there was literally on the other side of the page, the opposite opinion, so that you could read both sides of an issue.
Like he said, she said, or whatever.
Right. I think what they're saying is that they're doing away with that because now that most people aren't reading the print version, that it doesn't make sense. So now they're only having editorial or
guest essays. Right. So now at age 50, the designation will be retired, Editorials will still be called editorials, but the articles written by outside writers will be known as guest essays.
Yeah, they say the impulses that made the op-ed successful from the get-go are still in play. One is the allure of clashing opinions well expressed. As Herbert Bayard Swoop, an editor for the New York World newspaper in the 1920s, who was a pioneer of the concept of an op-ed page, once said, "Nothing is more interesting than opinion when opinion is interesting." Or, in the words of John B. Oakes, a longtime predecessor of mine who drove the creation of op-ed, quote, "Diversity of opinion is the lifeblood of democracy."
So what do you think about this transition? Is it truly meaningful? Is it titular? Is it,
Well, I find it especially interesting because it feels like I've said before, like some of the objectivity of news writing has turned into opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad to see they're still using opinion as a section for her to write this article, the author being Kathleen Kingsbury. So I think that that's good, right? Because what I wouldn't want to see is doing away with everything opinion and it's all editorial or a guest contribution, in which case it blurs the line in a way that you don't have any sort of way of delineating again between
Right.
which is which. So I do think it's interesting. I mean, I wonder how many other newspapers are going to follow suit or if they're going to keep using op-ed and it's just the New York Times that's done away with it.
Right. So why do you think they did it? Do you have, a gut feeling?
Well, my initial concern before I fully understood the structure of it was that it was going to help hide the fact that opinion has seeped into a lot of the editorial writing.
Right.
So that was my initial concern when I saw that headline and didn't fully grasp what they were trying to say. Assuming that that's actually the rationale and that it's not that they want to just hide the fact that opinion and editorial is all kind of the same thing and it's all in the same sandbox and let's not let anybody think about it. So that was my initial concern was, I hope they're not trying to hide the fact that
everything's editorial.
Everything is
in your opinion.
My concern is that so much of what I read has more of a narrative driven approach to the language and tone and even the way that it's presented, that it reminds me much more of what we're doing as publicists than what I learned in journalism school and strove to do at the newspaper. So it raises a red flag for me of, okay, let's keep an eye on this and make sure that it doesn't become, we only have editorial and then we have guest pieces. And those are the two categories. So that would be my concern, is that we're moving in that direction. But I don't know that that's the case. It's more just, let's put a pin in that and watch what happens to make sure that it doesn't become that,
Well, they claim that they are not an unthinking assembly line or disinterested referees. We want not only individual essays to have intention, but also the collective report itself to have intention. We, like the people we invite to write essays for us, to sometimes be surprised by the offer. We like to experience the same surprise when we read submissions from voices who are new to us on topics we may not yet understand. And we have our thumb on our scale in the name of progress, fairness, and a shared humanity.
Well, sounds nice. Also sounds a little like messaging.
I know. Who wrote that and how long did it take to come up with each and every word that they selected?
And what PR firm was behind it?
Right.
I think as long as opinions that don't represent that of the newspaper are published within a newspaper, I think we're okay as a society, but that assumes that those things are allowed. And I know we did see that there was that one opinion writer from the New York Times who bounced out
like a year or so ago.
Yeah. And she wrote that long piece about why she was leaving because she was being harassed for not having the same opinion. These are the things I just like to earmark and say, keep an eye on this because it's very important for a free society that we present all voices. and
Yep.
all opinions.
Correct.
And then let the court of public
right.
opinion decide.
Right. If everybody decides that, this person or this ideology is crackpot, then.
Right. I think the moment you start suppressing things that you don't want out there as ideas, you're not any better than these people that are behind the ones in the film, right? That's why we need more investigative journalists like Diana and Richard and Glenn Greenwald and other people who are just devoted to telling the truth regardless of the impact.
Right. Dig. They're amazing.
They are.
So do you like the idea of there being guest essays as opposed to being called op-eds? Do you think that it means anything?
I assume it's mostly the same.
Yeah. Like I said, the biggest thing I learned from that, it was what op-ed meant, which I thought it meant something else.
Opinion editorial. That's what I thought too.
Right.
A little bit embarrassing all these years later.
I don't know. Now I think that they're making it up that it meant something else.
I mean, that's also
rewriting history.
That's also possible. I don't know.
Is there any fact in the world? All right.
Oh God. All right. I think we did it.
Yes, I think we covered that in weird ways to our satisfaction.
Perfect. Cool. Thank you so much for tuning in for the PR Wind Down podcast.
And thank you to our special guests, Richard and Diana, for a phenomenal interview.
It was so awesome. Remember to submit your own agency stories and questions and just share our show with your friends and colleagues. If you subscribe and leave us a rating, it will help us reach new listeners like you.
And if you have an anonymous PR horror story of your own, send it our way at the contact email below the episode notes.
We can't wait to wind down with you again next time.